What are you seeing out there in terms of, and just in terms of setting this up, I'll turn it over to the larger panel. Vivek, I want to hear what you have to say. We also have Alexander Mercouris from the podcast The Duran, which is one of the top geopolitical podcasts. We also have Colonel Daniel Davis, who's a military expert. I thought it'd be good to get their larger perspective. But Vivek, let's start with you. How are you? What are you seeing out there right now?
Well, look, I'm seeing a lot of fear, actually. And so the seat I'm in is running for U.S. president. I'm seeing fear of candidates in their willingness to confront the reality of what we're facing for a wide range of reasons that are largely unimportant, but we can get into if people are interested in. And I think there's that fear is resulting in confusion in analyzing different dimensions of what's at issue here in Israel. And then let's zoom out what the recent attacks on Israel might have as an implication for broader risks of World War III that we're entering at a time of deep, I would say tension and concern in places like Ukraine and Russia. So as it relates to Israel, look, there's a couple of different questions at issue that I think have been conflated with each other. I mean, one is the question of justice of the response or proportionality or humanitarian concern for Palestinians as a consequence of Israel invading Gaza. This is largely a criticism coming from some wings of the left. My perspective is, for now, just put that to one side, right? Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel absolutely has a national right to self-existence. But that question has been wrongly conflated with a more obvious question that enough people have not asked critically, which is a ground invasion in Gaza really going to succeed at all in any measurable definition of success for Israel? And, to the extent that the U.S. gets involved in this, looking at it from a U.S. perspective, to the extent the U.S. gets involved, which I have views on. And even if it does succeed, there's a third question. Even if it meets some near-term definition of success, such as the one that's been offered, which is toppling Hamas, is that even an outcome that is a good outcome in absence of knowing who actually replaces Hamas? So those are almost three different questions, David. And I think that what I'm seeing in the political landscape, in the landscape of politicians, is a reluctance or a purposeful refusal to separate those questions and actually answer them head on directly. And then you zoom out from Israel. I mean, this has all taken place against the backdrop of a Ukrainian war that continues to extend. I think the $61 billion proposed in the $106 billion foreign aid package that Biden has proposed here makes really no gesture towards even why this would help achieve any outcome of finality in this war. And so this continues to, I worry, make the Russia-China alliance even stronger, further committing the U.S. to this conflict without a clear path towards resolution or definition of success. You take a look at, let's just play out what could happen in Israel, and I think that this is a very reasonable scenario. Israel goes in for a ground invasion of Gaza. That leaves Israel vulnerable from the north. Hezbollah attacks, makes good on its pre-existing threats to hit Israel in the north, but it puts Israel in a two-front war that it's difficult to imagine the U.S. would not get involved in, which in turn crosses the red lines of Iranian-backed militias throughout the Middle East to hit U.S. targets, from the Badr Brigade in Iraq to the Houthis in Yemen. That has us then in a regional war in the Middle East that I do not think leads to a good place for the U.S., which in turn probably rolls out the red carpet for China to further accelerate its window of opportunity to look after Taiwan, which China may not have looked to as quickly if it had not been for the U.S. being diluted and distracted in both Ukraine and the Middle East. And that's what a path to significant world conflict, call it World War III, God forbid, could look like, all against the backdrop of our own homeland here in the United States, our border defenses, our missile defenses, our space-based defense capabilities, our cyber, super EMP defense capabilities, all being as vulnerable as we have ever been. And so I'm seeing some in the GOP and otherwise call for recalling the Department of Defense a Department of Offense. I think as a matter of a verbal tick, that would be a mistake, but in some ways it's an honest depiction of where many politicians in both the Democrat and Republican Party are. I think that's a mistake.
It should be called the Department of War.
It should be. That's what they've been.
For a very long time, it was the Department of War. And now it's, and then in the fairly recent times, from a historical standpoint, they changed it to the Department of Defense. But really, we do conduct war We just, I mean, it can hardly be called defense if we're going to defend ourselves by attacking.
It would have been
I
Well,
nice.
think we should call it the
Nikki,
Department of War. Okay, come
not
on.
not to be outdone, but Nikki Haley wants to call it the Department of Offense. Uh,
Yeah.
all right. Well, let me
Well,
Vivek,
and like the best defense is an offense.
Yeah.
as if we're not already offensive enough. But okay, so Vivek, you laid out a bunch of different concerns there, and I think you broke it down into a framework that's pretty good. I just want to kind of go one by one through the concerns, and it sounds like the first place to start is just what are likely to be the military repercussions of a ground invasion of Gaza by Israel, and is it likely to succeed, and what will the consequences be? So for that, I want to pull in Colonel Daniel Davis, who is something of a military expert here, who I think is looking at this situation and has also looked at previous incursions by Israel into Gaza. There's one in 2008 called Operation Cast Lead. There was one in 2014 called Operation Protective Edge. So this wouldn't be the first time that Israel has entered Gaza. So we have some data points on what it might look like. Colonel, are you there? Do you want to?
Yeah. Yes, I am. Thanks, David. This is actually the fifth one. There was also wars in 2012 and 2021. So there's a lot of experience we have here, and everything from just short incursions using lots of air power to outright invasions of portions of the Gaza Strip. And what you have every time is inconclusive results. Really, to Mr. Ramaswamy's comments there a second ago, that, you know, what would success even look like? Because even if you somehow, and I don't know how you would do it, but if you killed every single Hamas member, all of the people still live there, and all of the conditions under which all of these wars keep rising still exist, and in fact it'll be worse. But this is going to be substantially more difficult than anything that Israel has faced so far, because Hamas this time is expressly prepared for it. They spent months getting the terrain ready. It's not just the tunnels under the ground, though that's a big issue. It's also how they prepared buildings. They have false floors in some of the high-rise buildings. They have holes between the walls. They can move around different places. They have booby traps set up. I mean, this is about as hard as you can imagine. And even some of these buildings that have been rubbled so far by the Israeli airstrikes actually are not going to help the Israel come in, because that prevents them from using their armor. They can't go down some of these streets. And just like it did with the Russians in the World War II Battle of Stalingrad, those actually are good places to defend from, because once it's been rubbled, you don't even know where to shoot anymore from the IDF perspective. So this is going to be much harder than any of the other ones were, and also because the objectives are different. In 2014 and 2021, the objective for the IDF was to stop the rockets that were firing into Israel. So they just looked for rocket launch sites. Now then, they're expressly going to destroy the organization itself. So to do that, you have to go building by building, house by house, and room by room in some cases, because your objective is to kill everybody who's in Hamas, or get them to surrender. And of course, Hamas is not going to surrender. They're prepared for this. So this is going to be a very long, very bloody siege, and Israel is going to suffer significant casualties, because you have to use infantry for this. It's great that they have these Merkava tanks and the Namur armored personnel carriers and lots of other technological capacity, but those fights are on the ground, and that's where you lose a lot of your advantages. And so the enemy Hamas will have an advantage because they know the terrain better, and when it gets into man-on-man fight, it's just a bloody struggle that nobody really has a big advantage on.
It seems to me that if Israel gets bogged down in guerrilla fighting in Gaza, that they're going to want to lean heavily on air support and artillery. Does that make sense? And then, you know, what are the consequences of that for
Yes.
the civilian population?
As a matter of fact, that's also what happened in 2014 attack, is that the Israel went in with very, very loose rules of engagement. They were heavy use of air power, of artillery, mortar fire, rocket systems, their own versions of like anti-tank missiles, so to speak. All of these were wantonly used. They didn't have targeted and detailed, the so-called surgical strikes, which they claim They didn't in 2014, and they certainly haven't so far. And so the casualties are always dramatically disproportionate to the on the Palestinian side or the civilians. And so many, of course, you've seen they've had two separate leaflet draws where the Israelis are telling the Palestinians to move south. But all of them aren't going to be able to move. Some of them, they can't. They're old, they're infirm, they're already wounded, or there's just nowhere to go. So there's going to be a lot of people there, whether they want them to be there or not. And then, of course, we haven't even talked about the whole hostage situation and the pressure that's putting on both the Israeli government and the American government to hold off on these attacks. But the military perspective is going to be very, very destructive and bad for everybody involved.
All right, thank you. So, Alexander, let me ask you. I think what Colonel Davis is laying out is that this is going to be a long operation. It's not going to be a short operation. It's going to be fraught with difficulty. It's likely to have, a significant collateral damage, if you want to call it that. I'm not sure we should be using that phrase, but you get the idea. During that time, I guess lay out for us what the geopolitical consequences could be. Hezbollah has threatened to invade from the north. We're already seeing unrest on the West Bank. I guess lay out for us how the dominoes could fall. Who else could be drawn into this conflict while that ground invasion is happening?
Well, first of all, there is a real possibility of a wider regional war. Hezbollah and Hamas have been allies and friends. If there's a battle in Gaza, there will be pressure on Hezbollah to take action in northern Israel, and of course that has the potential to expand. Behind Hezbollah, there is Iran, and of course also Syria. So one can see how that can spread. One can see how the fighting can spread. And of course, the United States is worried about the fact that it's got many troops spread out across the Middle East. It's got people in Syria. It's got people in Iraq. It's got people in many places, but those are perhaps the places where they're most vulnerable. And of course, there are allies of Hezbollah, the Lebanese Hezbollah, both in Syria and in Iraq. And if the fighting spreads, one can imagine that with the United States supporting Israel, it could potentially expand and extend that way. However, I think that initially, at least, even as the fighting escalates in Gaza, and I've just heard all that Colonel Davis had to say about how we a prolonged and very bloody campaign in Gaza. I think that the political will of most of the Arab and Middle East countries, including Iran, will be to try to leverage the battle in Gaza politically. So I think that there will be growing pressure from them to have a united Arab Islamic response. We could see the activation of the Arab League. We could see the activation of the Islamic Conference. We could see attempts to try to increase pressure for a ceasefire, which is what they will be working towards in the United Nations, in other international fora. We could see agitation amongst the very large Muslim populations that now exist in Europe. And of course, beyond those populations, many people in Europe especially will be nervous about a conflict in the Middle East. And previously, when we had operations by Israel in Gaza, like Operation Cast Lead, for example, there were protests again demanding a ceasefire. And the longer the operation in Gaza continues, and the more violence there is, and the more civilians die, and the more film of civilians dying circulates around the world, the greater the pressure is going to be. And eventually, the pressure, I suspect, will become so great that a ceasefire of some kind is imposed, or at least the demand for it becomes irresistible. At which case, the question comes, what has been achieved by that military operation? Because, of course, if Hamas is still there in Gaza, is in a position to say, well, we survived this onslaught, then, of course, they will be able to claim that they've achieved some kind of a victory. So I think that is the most likely scenario. There are possible ones. There are possibilities of a wider regional war. But as I said, I don't think the Arab states or the Iranians want to see it. And also, and perhaps there is also a possibility, a small possibility, but a real one, that the other two big nuclear superpowers might become involved as well. The Russians have troops in Syria. If the overspill affects them, they've already given warnings that they've got hypersonic missiles that can reach the Eastern Mediterranean. But I think the two big nuclear superpowers will be waiting in the wings, looking to exploit the situation, seeking to coordinate, as Putin has already said, um, diplomatic initiatives in the United Nations and in the Security Council, looking to isolate the United States and, above all, seeking to take control of the diplomatic process in the Middle East, to the one that seeks to negotiate peace in the Middle East between Israel and the Arab states and Israel and the Palestinians, to take that away from the United States. And the Chinese especially are now talking about setting up a wider international conference. We don't quite know what that means, but some kind of conference, because they're saying that the Americans have failed.
So you seem to be laying out a somewhat optimistic scenario here, in that you think the response by the larger Arab and Muslim world will be a political response, that it will not immediately turn into a wider war. I guess the question then is, does Iran have the ability to keep Hezbollah out of it? Will Hezbollah stay out of it? I mean, that seems like the very tactical question here, because it seems like if this were to escalate, the first place it would escalate would be Hezbollah attacking from the north, or perhaps Israel believing that such an attack is imminent and then striking first preemptively. I mean, that could happen too. So, but I guess, is it your view that that Hezbollah will be willing to stand down here, in order to allow this larger political process to work its way out?
I think that is what the Iranians and the Arab states would want to see happen. But of course, they are also themselves the subject of intense political pressure. If violence is seen to escalate in Gaza, then it may be very difficult for them to retain control of the situation. Hezbollah itself, the one in Lebanon, is a relatively disciplined organization. But other Shia militias and Islamic militias across the Middle East are not. And though I think that that is what the Arab and Muslim states will want to do, one can't assume that that is what will happen. There's always a great difference between, what people want to achieve, that they want to keep it under political control, to pursue a political diplomatic process in which they leverage events to their advantage. And then there are the events themselves, which in a crisis of this kind can always get out of control. Things might happen anywhere in the Middle East. We are talking about the Middle East, a very volatile region. And of course, if things start to happen, if, for example, there are attacks on American bases in Syria, I'm not saying that's what will happen, but let's assume that that does happen, and the United States responds, then you can start to see how that could set a whole ball of events rolling, which might not just be limited to conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, but a conflict that starts to involve regional actors, many regional actors, and perhaps even ultimately great powered ones. So it's a
And
dangerous
David, if I
situation.
could, David, if I could jump in for a
Sure.
second on that point, one of the things tactically that we would want to watch out for, I agree with Alexander that I think most of the actors in this region do want to avoid a larger war because everyone knows that they could find themselves on the wrong end of a missile. So they don't want to do that if they can avoid it. But I think that when this incursion happens, if assuming that it's going to happen in short order, like it seems to be, that I don't think that you'll see Hamas immediately launch out there. I think that they'll probably wait and see how things develop because I also strongly agree with what Alexander said about the pressure on the people. If Israel goes in there and has a similar lack of control as they did in 2014 and lots of Palestinian people start getting killed and they're literally just dismantling the city, there's going to be enormous pressure from the regular Arab street, so-called, then not to want to see their people just get slaughtered. And then there could be a lot of pressure on Hezbollah. Hezbollah would wait until Israel got itself, stuck in this, beehive, so to speak, and then they might come. I don't think they would launch immediately because if Israel probably is going to be ready at the outset, but if they get bogged down and they're weaker, then there's the greater risk that Hezbollah comes in, and that's where the biggest risk for Israel would come in.
Is there any risk that Israel looks at the situation and says to themselves, a war with Hezbollah is inevitable. It's coming. We can only choose the timing, perhaps.
In fact, I think you're seeing people talk about that right now. That a lot of them are saying, "Hey, let's just get this whole thing done right now. It's inevitable. It's going to happen." So there is definitely some talk about having a preemptive strike to even start that process ahead of time so that they have the advantage from the beginning. But, we saw in the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah, that's not an easy task. And that was at best a draw in 2006. And I don't think Israel, their senior leaders, I don't think is going to be eager to start a two-front war on their own. So I think that will hold them back. But there are definitely people who think that they want to, but they underestimate how hard war is. Let me just say that.
Yeah. All right. Let me go to Policy Tensor here. You wrote a really interesting piece the other day in which you laid out the chain reaction that could follow in a manner similar to World War I, where Israel goes into Gaza. They seem to be destroying Hamas. The destruction of Hamas is not something that Hezbollah is willing to tolerate. The destruction of Hezbollah is not something that Iran is willing to tolerate, and so on from there. And so even though it's safe to say that the major players in the region don't want a wider war right now, they might find themselves compelled into one because the alternative, in their view, is worse. Can you speak to kind of that chain reaction that could happen? Can you lay out for us what you laid out in your piece?
Right. So I think what has happened is that U.S. foreign policy has driven an entire vertical sort of coalition, a very asymmetric one.
I think he's a listener.
Sorry?
Sorry, what's that, Vivek?
I think it just shows up as him being a listener, so I'm not sure if he can speak.
No, he's speaking.
Okay.
That's quite right. So what is happening is that the interlocking series of responses here is very dangerous. We want to destroy Hamas, but Hamas is an asset that has been cultivated by Hezbollah and the Iranians for decades now, and they don't want to see that destroyed. There's, apart from the public pressure on Hezbollah to jump in and Iran to jump in, that's another consideration, a strategic consideration that they must keep in mind. Now, the same thing applies further up. So we would like to destroy, Israel would like to destroy Hezbollah because Hezbollah poses an even greater threat than Hamas does. But that certainly is not tolerable, will not be tolerated by Iran. Iran cannot let Hezbollah go. It is their main weapon in the Levant. And the same goes much further up. So Iran, if the US and Israel end up fighting Iran, that's very dangerous for the great powers. So Russia cannot tolerate the United States and Israel crushing Iran. And that logic goes one step further still, which is that China cannot tolerate a strategic defeat for Russia. So they can make neutral noises, but behind the scenes they are backing Russia. So we are facing an entire coalition reminiscent of World War One, where, if you remember the dynamic that led to the crisis in July 1914, it was Austria wanted to crush Serbia, the Serbian nationalists, but Russia couldn't allow that because the Serbian nationalists were one of the main weapons, just like today Hezbollah is the main weapon for Iran. And then further up, the other powers had very strong interests in preventing this sort of thing. So we are walking on very thin ice here. The risk of escalation is today higher than it has been in a very, very long time, decades easily, in the lifetimes of most of the people on this discussion. So I'm very worried. What is required, as I wrote in that dispatch, was we need to talk not just to the Arabs, not just to the Europeans and our friends that we always talk to. We need to talk to our adversaries. We need to not just issue deterrent threats to Iran. We need to reassure Iran that we are not going to destroy Hezbollah, and that we won't allow Israel to destroy Hezbollah. That's the only way we can control escalation here. Unless we do that, this is going to escalate.
That's an interesting point. You're saying that it's not enough just to deter Hezbollah and Iran from entering the conflict, and we have heard those statements from the Biden administration. But you're saying it's important to also privately reassure them that they will not be preemptively attacked or
Right.
become the target.
Right, because the pressure on Israel is going to be tremendous to go after Hezbollah after they're done with Hamas.
Interesting. Okay, so Vivek, let me bring this back to you. So we recently had a statement by Mitch McConnell saying that the United States is up against, a new axis of evil. He reused George W. Bush's famous phrase, or should I say infamous, to say that we're now up against a new axis of evil consisting of China, Russia, and Iran. I guess my question about that is, was such, let's call it a tripolar alliance or axis that we're up against here, was that inevitable, or is that produced as a function of U.S. policy?
Yeah, I think it's directly a function of U.S. policy. David, you can hear me, right? My phone was acting up. Yeah, it was acting up for a second.
Yes,
So,
we hear you.
no, I think that, on the China-Russia side, let's just go step by step. I think that this was and is in plain sight a function of U.S. policy. The good news and the bad news, depending on how you want to look at it, David, is I think that this is still corrigible. This can still be corrected. But I worry that this Ukraine war and the specter of NATO admitting Ukraine to NATO is one of the catalysts that is further creating and driving Russia further into China's arms. I don't think that further cutting off and isolating Russia from the West is helping the matter with respect to increasing Russia's own reliance on China. I don't think bombing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline helped particularly in that respect either. And so when you do see Putin and Xi Jinping meeting, they're saying a lot of flowery things. But if you look in the kinks of the armor there are kinks in that relationship, right? Every time, at least after the 2022 No Limits partnership was announced, I don't think it's an accident that Putin sent military resources, sold military equipment to each of India and Vietnam, both of which share a border with China. I don't think it's an accident that Putin still has not allowed the completion of a railroad in northeast China to make its way to the sea, crossing Russian territory, because he doesn't particularly, I believe, enjoy being the little brother in that relationship. Yet it's a relationship, a fraternal relationship we've nonetheless further solidified by isolating Russia and by further going in the direction of really pushing them into China's arms. I was, I think there was a lot of things about McConnell's statement that bothered me. But when you bring Iran into this now, I think that one of the things as well in a tenuous moment like this one is the way you describe the alliance actually reinforces the reality of that alliance. And so I think that far ahead of when it has to necessarily be a Russia, China, Iran alliance, the more the U.S. talks about it that way, and the more U.S. leaders presume that their policy has to be made in that direction, the more you actually force the very outcome that we might not otherwise want to see. And so if I'm answering your question, David, did U.S. policy produce it? The answer is absolutely. And you could say that maybe it was already heading in that direction. Did we at least exacerbate it? I think the answer is yes. But the good news is there are also decisions we can make now. I believe actually starting in Ukraine, actually, even if we're to look at that separate situation, although our funding bill requires debating them together, I think there are decisions we can make in Ukraine now that reduce that risk that still would have implications for also avoiding broader escalation in the Middle East, leading to great power involvement. That's my view.
Is the administration has now linked support for Ukraine and support for Israel. They've done so obviously in this funding bill. They've also done so rhetorically. Is your I take it you disagree with that? That these are two separate conflicts, and in fact, they may be a zero sum game. Certainly, the amount of stockpiles that we have, like say 155 millimeter artillery shells, that is a zero sum game. What we give to one at this point must result in a reduction to the other. Is that your view? These two things are competing interests, not
I
complementary
absolutely
interests.
think they're competing interests. See, so what I would say is in the front end, we need to debate these individually, right? Because it shoehorns a particular conflict by way of analogy. And I think we have this bad habit in our foreign policy of analogizing rather than analyzing. I think we have to analyze each situation individually. And I think the US interests that are at issue in the case of Ukraine versus in the case of Israel versus in the case of Taiwan and the Asia Pacific versus in protecting our own border. These are separate questions that need to be analyzed separately, yet are all hodgepodged, shoehorned into a single bill. That the purpose of doing this, I think, is pretty obvious, is to sidestep debate on any individual one of those measures, precisely to pass all of them together. And it's no accident that if you went with 61 billion to Ukraine directly, there's no way that would have passed Congress. But using the Israel as conflict as a Trojan horse, as a vehicle to ram in a bill, the majority of which of the spending is going to Ukraine, is an obvious gambit to avoid that debate. But the irony, David, is again, by viewing these things together, the consequences could indeed converge. I mean, in the scenarios that Alexander and Daniel and others and the policy type person I think have discussed, the consequences could cause these conflicts to converge in a way that we don't want. But I think right now on the front end, our best way of preventing that from happening is to look at each of these conflicts individually. Now, to put my cards on the table for where I land on each of them, people may say I'm not just making this procedural point. I think the procedural point stands regardless of whether you stand for more or less Ukraine aid or more or less Israel aid. I think you should debate these issues separately. Where I come out is I don't think that any further material U.S. involvement in this Ukraine war is at all worth it. There's still a reasonable path to a peace agreement that could require Russia to at least weaken its commitment and alliance with China at a moment where we also end a reasonable path to resolution in Ukraine that allows Ukraine to come out with its sovereignty intact, cede the Russian occupied regions in Luhansk and Donetsk that are Russian speaking regions, yes, and in the context of making sure that NATO never admits Ukraine to NATO. And we can talk about that in more depth, but I think there's reasonable path to resolution there. And then I do think a condition, this is a little bit more controversial or maybe similarly controversial in some Republican circles, but I do think that any U.S. involvement in this war in Israel has to, at minimum, be conditioned on Israel clearly defining its own objectives, its own path to, I worry it's a fork in the road that could lead to bad outcomes either way. If Israel gets mired in Gaza without accomplishing its stated goal, or even if Israel does accomplish its stated goal, either of those could be bad outcomes both for Israel and the U.S. over the long run. And I think that we need to have a clear understanding of what those objectives are so that the U.S. can be clear about what we will or won't support. And I think the problem with barreling this forward right now in this conflated debate is it's designed to stifle that discussion. And I don't think that asking those questions are anti-Israel. To the contrary, I think you can make a very strong argument that that's a pro-Israel stance because it's arguably better for Israel to have these questions sorted out before the U.S. waddles into this war. But certainly from a U.S. perspective, it's absolutely in our interest to demand answers to those questions too.
Let me go to Alexander. I want to get your reaction to this McConnell axis of evil comment. It seems to me that there's two issues with it. One is that when you declare someone to be an enemy in international relations, it has a self-fulfilling aspect to it. I mean, they're going to hear that, and realize that they're in your gun sights and start to react accordingly. And even if we were in an adversarial relationship or a competitive relationship with these countries, you don't necessarily want them to upgrade their view of the threat, and work together in a more tightly coordinated way. I mean, the going back to the Romans, their motto was divide and rule. They did not want to face enemies working together. They wanted to kind of deal with them one at a time. And it seems to me that a comment like the acts of evil really pushes all these countries to be working together even more tightly than they may already have been. And then the other part of it is just the level of the rhetoric. When you actually call someone evil, um, again, that's saying more than that they're just a competitor or adversary. It's almost implying that you can't live with that regime, and it's not clear to me at all that that needs to be our position with respect to China or Russia. We can share the earth with these countries and these regimes, even if we are in an adversarial relationship. But when you up the rhetoric that way, I worry about what their perception is going to be. What's your take on that?
I think that is absolutely correct. Firstly, if you're going to start calling a whole lot of different countries enemies and doing it at the same time, and if you're the United States, which is the world's strongest military power, then of course the instinct of all of those countries that are being called enemies is that they will all start to work with each other, which, going back to what Vivek was saying, is exactly what is happening. A couple of years ago, 10 years ago, you would not have seen the Chinese and the Russians talking about a no limits partnership in the way that you are seeing them do now. Nor was it likely that Russia and Iran would be getting so close to each other that they're engaging in military cooperation. They're all doing this at this time precisely because they are feeling that the United States is coming after them, or at least their governments feel that. So inevitably, they're making common cause, and the result is that the America's security problems that way are multiplying, which is going back to your initial point, where you started this program. That's exactly the concern that people and at the diplomats, the people who were speaking to Axios were saying. They talked there about North Korea as well, by the way, and we see now the Russians working with the North Koreans, perhaps importing shells from North Korea, talking perhaps about supplying technology to North Korea. So at that level, this is not wise policy. You don't take on all your enemies at once or your potential adversaries at once. And that ought to be basic statecraft. But you're absolutely also right about rhetoric and about where we are. And this comes back to the point about the First World War and how that all started, because the origins of the First World War are much debated. But if you are talking about the July crisis, there was a total collapse in diplomacy. There was no effective diplomatic action. And that is exactly what we are seeing now. Now, perhaps there are back channels that we don't know about. But at the moment, the Americans are not talking to the Russians. The Russians are not able to talk back to the Americans. There's no clear sign that these two countries are speaking to each other, as, for example, they did during the 1973 crisis, the 1973 war between Israel and the Arab states. Relations between China and the United States have also become extremely difficult. Xi Jinping has been avoiding meetings with President Biden. The Americans want meetings, but relations between China and the United States have become so fractious that at the moment they're not able to communicate with each other as effectively as they should. There was a telephone conversation between the Chinese and American foreign ministers, but apparently didn't go very well, and they were simply stating positions at each other. And of course, none of the major parties, Israel and the United States, are talking to Iran. So, in a situation where everybody sees the United States as an enemy and the United States treats all of these countries as part of an axis of evil, diplomacy, proper diplomatic action, which is what is needed to contain this crisis, isn't happening. And that is one of the reasons why it is so dangerous.
Well, I think the traditional Republican Party is to blame for a lot of this, frankly, because you have Biden making certain decisions, but the party that is supposed to check him is actually has no alternative vision grounded in diplomacy for how we're actually going to avoid this war. And I am deeply worried. I mean, it's part of the reason I'm doubly committed to being as vocal on this as I've been, that it is not in our interest to escalate a war in Russia that is against our interests. At the same time, now that if you play it out, I mean, there aren't. If you logically play out step by step, the question of when for Hezbollah in the north is an open question. Do they wait till Israel's mired in a total disaster of a ground conflict in Gaza before Hezbollah strikes, or before Israel, decides to strike preemptively? But this leads to two different conflicts that, even in the U.S.'s stated goals, if China is really the great rival that we need to worry about, neither of those is being advanced. In fact, we're weakening our position potentially of a Chinese near-term invasion of Taiwan. The deterrence strategy, I think, is gone in a zero-sum game of being able to face two different fronts with Russia and now a broader regional war in the Middle East, neither of which directly advance U.S. interests. And so, I do think that there's a element of this even in the United States where it's fashionable to look back and say, how did we possibly have bipartisan support to end up with 20 years of a no-win war in Iraq, or similar result in Afghanistan, where 20 years later the Taliban is still in charge? People like me say these things on the campaign trail, and that's an easy thing to say right now. But the harder part is to look at the present and look at the, I would say, forces within the United States that have actually stifled debate within and even between the political parties precisely when we need it most. And so, I think it does take, probably right now more than ever, discussions among people who are outsiders to that process, to the, I would say, partisan sausage making. Elon, I'm curious for your take on this one, but you probably, the problem is easy to describe. It's obvious. Solutions are harder. But as a first step here, even a description of the problem is itself something that I don't think that either Democrats or Republicans, certainly in the mainstream of either party, acknowledges. Everything we've talked about here, I think, has been really useful. I find it to be very clear and almost a uncontroversial description of the problem. Yet even before we get to solutions, and I have my views on them, it's interesting that even this statement of the problem isn't something that you're really hearing from either of the mainstream branches of the Republicans or Democrats right now, which I think is a big part of the problem, and a big part of repeating the same mistakes that we made 20 years ago. We're about to watch them happen again in slow motion.
Sure. So, I think a number of people have touched on this issue, which I think is actually the most important issue, which is how do we avoid World War III? Because if you look at the various conflicts currently and likely potential conflicts, these things are obviously bad. There's people that a lot of people die and suffer, but they're not civilizational risks. But World War III is a civilizational risk that we may not recover from. So we want to, I think, prioritize avoiding World War III. That's actually what matters, and not as happened in World War I, have a regional conflict rapidly become a global conflict. And nobody at the start of World War I thought that would be the case. In fact, shortly before World War I, people were proclaiming that it's a future of peace is what, because war would be so terrible that nobody would do such a crazy thing. And the Kaiser, when he sent the troops off in August 1914, he said that they would be back by the time the leaves fall, meaning within a few months. So that was their expectation. Not massive devastation globally. So it's just important to bear in mind that to frame things correctly, that nobody expects or wants to have a World War III. So we need to think like, well, that could happen again, where things cascade out of control. Before you know it, you've got a massive global conflict with devastation that far exceeds World War I or World War II.
And if I could just jump in real quick there, like Vivek just said, the big problem that we have in the United States is that we don't even want to have a dialogue and a discussion. I wrote a piece, I think it was in Newsweek about a week or so ago, where too many people in our country today still think this is like the 1990s, where the Soviet Union disintegrated, where China was a third world country and they couldn't do anything, and we could literally do anything we wanted to. And you're seeing that on graphic display right now. Not only did it lead to our disaster for 2 decades in Afghanistan, but now then you see people saying, like, I'm talking like U.S. representatives, lots of senators. It's not just the speaker there, but they're saying, hey, if the Hezbollah moves in, we should be ready to attack them. And if Iran does something, we should go in and attack their leadership. There's no discussion. There's no debate. There's no diplomacy, even in our mindset. We think we can just say, hey, we'll throw some missiles at you, and then that'll make you back down. And of course, almost the opposite is almost sure to happen, is because, as you also, I believe, just said, Vivek, you have already, we were putting Russia and China into each other's hand, Russia and Iran into each other's hand, Russia and North Korea, all these people that Bush called the axis of evil, other than Iraq, they're all coming in together against us. And that's not going to help our aid here. And if we don't, move towards diplomacy, and I really like your focus on that, Vivek, because I'm telling you, our military is not anywhere near as capable of handling all these things as some people think they are.
Correct.
And Daniel, go ahead, Elon. Yep.
In fact, if I may continue the line of thinking, I think you're absolutely right. People are overestimating U.S. military power. Now, I'm actually not someone who I'm not some peacenik. I'm not like I think there should be a peace and it's better, but I'm not like a sort of afraid of war or whatever. I just want to make sure we recognize reality. And we don't have the power differential that we used to have. If you said if the so-called axis of evil, and we should be careful of using axis because that was actually literally the name of the alliance in World War II that we're fighting. We don't want another axis. That's a real one. That's actually a very significant threat. And a combination of Russia, China, and Iran should be viewed as very strong relative to the West. Very strong.
May I add, Elon? The issue that is emerging now in the strategic balance is very, very dangerous. China's nuclear buildup is going to make it a great nuclear power, the same of a peer of Russia and the United States. Yes. That tripolar nuclear order is very dangerous. We cannot hold both these powers and balance both these powers at the strategic realm. What we need to do is get Europe to get its act together and develop a full deterrent so that they can hold the line against Russia while we hold the line in Asia. This is a very important thing. People are not thinking carefully about this, but we need to do this over the next 5-6 years. Otherwise, it's going to get very dangerous.
Yeah. Well, I'm just looking at saying, like, to the point that was mentioned a moment ago, actually that touched on by a number of people, that we're not fighting small fry here, or at least the potential is not a small fry battle. It is a massive battle where the industrial capacity is of comparable size to sort of the Western Alliance
or greater. Yes. I mean, at this point,
Correct.
China has more manufacturing capacity than the United States.
Mm-hmm. That is correct.
And Europe combined.
Yes, it's roughly on par. Let's just say, like, one could debate whether it's bigger or but it's the point is that we do not have an overwhelming advantage in industrial might, and the foundation of war is economics. This should be obvious to everyone, but it's often at this point is lost. The foundation of war is economic power, especially industrial output. Basically, how many tanks and guns and drones can you make relative to the other side? That's what it comes down to. And And in fact, it may be the case, if not now, in the future, it probably will be that a Russia-China-Iran alliance can outproduce the Western alliance. Let's just say the point is that in order for there to be a global conflict of a World War III, you have to have two superpower alliances like that where one cannot easily defeat the other one, and that is the case, and that I think is a massive shift in thinking. People do not understand. Most people do not understand. I think people on this call perhaps understand, but I do understand, but most do not. This is so. I think we want to try to avoid that, and I hope it is not something that is historic that where the tides of history are simply going to sweep us in this direction, because there's a strong argument that these things are actually unavoidable, and the tides of history will sweep us in that direction whether we like it or not. But we should try to avoid that if at all possible, and unfortunately, our policy has been forcing really Russia and Iran to ally with China. It's been forcing them. What choice have we given them? And so, and Russia has the raw materials, and China has the industrial capacity. It's frankly a perfect match from a war standpoint. So I think we need to stop doing that. It's unwise. And I think will lead to immense risk to civilization. I just want to emphasize that, that there's civilizational risk. There are tragedies on an individual level, tragedies on a community level, and then there's civilizational risk. We just need to make sure that we are not putting civilization itself at stake, which is World War III.
Elon, I think that you're saying it very elegantly. About talking about civilizational risk, which I agree with. I'm talking to you from Iowa. Just did a town hall with people at a pizza ranch here in Iowa, and I'll tell you what I share with people. Where, yeah, I think everyone understands civilizational risk as like sort of a ethereal concept that's like really bad, and we need to avoid it. But if we're just to literally take exactly what you said, including the industrial combined might, including also raw material might of China, including the fact that the foundation of war is economics and industrial capacity, including the facts of what a potential Russia, China, Iran military alliance could look like. I just want to say the same thing in a different way that I hope catalyzes a level of debate that we're not having in U.S. politics right now. If we do enter World War III, it is likely that the United States as we know it will cease to exist. And I think that, yes, that's just a different way of saying civilizational risk, because there's a lot of other things that would also cease to exist. But when you look at Russia's hypersonic missile capabilities, nuclear capabilities, both of which are ahead of ours, China's naval capacity, which arguably is ahead of ours, combined with our economic dependence on China, combined with, a range of other factors, even if you tally up the litany of Western allies versus what this alternative alliance between Russia, China, and increasingly, if we go into scenario, nations like Iran and North Korea, I think it's important for people to understand, especially when the U.S. homeland is as vulnerable as we have been in modern memory, not just from a border perspective, but from missile defense or cyber defense or defenses against super electromagnetic pulse attacks. I think this is where I am attempting, unsuccessfully so far, but attempting to awaken a GOP from what appears to be a deep slumber on the risks of of real major conflict. If we enter major conflict, anything resembling World War III against a Russia-China alliance, with potentially Iran and or North Korea included on the other side of that, the United States as we know it will cease to exist. And at least I found that maybe to be a little bit more persuasive to people here to engaging in a dialogue on the ground than, the broader possibility of civilizational risk. The existence of the United States itself is what we're talking about as being on the line here. So I like the way you said it.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I mean, we are like the New York Yankees, or we're literally Yankees. So we're like a pro sports team that has been winning the championship for so long and so many years in a row that we have forgotten what losing even looks like. And that's when the
Yep.
championship team loses. When the championship, the team that's won so many times has had so many victories, that over time complacency and entitlement grow, and then you get your ass handed to you. So and this is, like I said, my concern here is civilizational risk. Um, how do we avoid that? I think we and this is not a populist statement at all, but I think we need to figure out peace in Ukraine, and I think we need to restore normal relations with Russia. And if we don't do that, we force Russia into a China alliance. They're already doing joint military exercises. Russia and China have started doing joint military exercises. I don't know how many people are aware of this, but that would be an alarm bell.
This might be a good point to bring in Alex Cristoforo, also from the Duran. The question I'd have for you, Alex, is détente with Russia still possible? I mean, are things too far gone, or can we normalize relations with them and take this risk off the table?
There was a time that I would have said, even 2-3 weeks ago, that there could be a path to rapprochement with Russia, but I think that door has closed, and I really think the big problem in all of this that's going on, whether it's the Middle East, Israel, or the conflict in Ukraine, is that the most unpredictable, chaotic actor in all of this is the Biden White House.
I'm not hearing anyone speak.
I think that's a bug, Elon. I think I can hear Alex.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
You guys can hear
Yeah,
me?
I can hear you.
Okay. I think the Biden White House is the part of this puzzle that is,
I can't hear him either, just FYI.
Can other people hear? I can hear. Alex,
can you guys hear?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
I think other people are having a problem. So I think the thing to do in this situation is why don't you drop out of the room and I'll re-invite you, and then just make sure that people can hear you.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, thanks, Alex.
I just wanted to pause on the magnitude of what while you're doing that, David. I think what Elon said makes eminent sense. I've been advocating this for a long time. Reopening relations with Russia, economic relations with Russia. I mean, like not bombing the Nord Stream 2. Let's start with that, but also renormalizing some level of economic relation with Russia, I don't think is unrealistic, actually. I think we live in a moment where it's certainly more realistic than what Kissinger and Nixon envisioned in the early 70s when they opened relations with China, right? Mao Zedong, say what you will about Vladimir Putin, Mao Zedong was a different animal. And yet, even against that backdrop, did we trust Mao? No, we did not. But we trusted him to follow his self-interest when he was the little brother in the relationship with Brezhnev-led USSR. And so today, do we have to trust Putin and believe that he is a virtuous saint on his way to, heavenly eternal bliss? No, we don't have to believe that. I think we have to believe that he has a self-interest that he will weigh, Russia will weigh, and he will weigh personally. And does that match the interests of the United States to reopen economic relations with Russia in the context of a reasonable path to peace in Ukraine that pulls Russia out of its military alliance, or at least from doing joint military exercises with China? And I think that that's actually, weird as it may sound to some, eminently achievable in this window. And so it's less even about the Ukraine war in this case, but something bigger you could achieve using the Ukraine war or the end of it as a catalyst to achieve that we should have been working towards anyway, which is to pull Russia out of that alliance with China. People say, well, how are you going to monitor that? Is that just a promise? That's a frequent objection that I get when I say this. Elon made a great point. They're doing joint military exercises. We know when they're doing them. They're doing them off the coast of Alaska and otherwise. If there are somebody who breaks an agreement, there's obviously consequences for that. That can be baked in to any agreement. but they wouldn't really have an incentive to if we reopen and renormalize some level of economic relations with Russia. And I do think that that is, at least as of 6 months ago, was outside the Overton window in American politics. But I think that given how bad the other options look, my hope is it finds its way right back into that Overton window. And, I certainly think it is a reasonable diplomatic path that's wide open and staring us in the face if we're willing to just step up and seize it. So I don't know if the other individual made his way back, David, but
Alex,
Yeah, I'm back. Can you guys hear me?
I can.
Hello?
Vivek, can you hear Alex?
I can't. No.
Oh, geez, we still have this bug.
Alex, it's definitely not on mute. It shows him on mute on my screen.
Oh, that's strange. Okay, we have a bug here because I can definitely hear Alex.
I can hear you guys.
My guess is he may be advocating for normalizing economic relations with Russia, and some people
Well, he was
may not like that very much.
No, Alex was sounding a pessimistic note about whether things are too far gone. But Alex, I'm sorry about this. We're gonna have to analyze this bug later. Maybe you're on a device that's not somehow supported. But I'll follow up with you separately, and we'll try to figure that out.
Okay. No worries. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, Elon, you said it pretty well. I mean, what do you think the first gambit would be? I mean, David, you might have some views on this too. I'm very
well. I actually proposed something a year ago, which I think is actually what will end up happening. At the time, I was attacked, relentlessly for it, which is that that there essentially be a ceasefire, that that we have some sort of internationally supervised vote in the eastern portion of Ukraine to see if they wish to be part of Russia or part of Ukraine, and go with that, because it does seem to me it doesn't make sense that we would want to foment a war to have regions that don't wish to be part of one country to be part of one country. Meaning, if the Eastern Ukrainian regions wish to be part of Russia, why are we fighting a war to force them to be part of Ukraine? That doesn't make sense. Do we believe in democracy or not? And now there's some counter arguments here, like, well, the people that used to live there aren't there anymore who are in favor of Ukraine. I'm like, well, invite them back, and give them a vote too. I think there at least some portions of the area that Russia occupies right now will in fact vote to be part of Russia. One has to ask, why is there not a significant insurgency in eastern Ukraine? If they're so against being part of Russia, you would expect to see a significant insurgency, and you just don't see that. I think the reality is at least some parts of eastern Ukraine and Crimea actually do wish to be part of Russia. That is the actual reality of the situation. I'm not saying all of it, but I think certainly some parts. And so then we also have to say, pragmatically, is Ukraine making progress? Well, no, they are not. And what is actually happening? Well, a lot of the flower of Ukrainian youth is being sacrificed in the trenches for essentially no territorial gains. Those boys are dying every day. For what? So I say this in the interest, as this is the best outcome for Ukraine. This is actually the best outcome for the people of Ukraine. This is not this is a pro-Ukraine outcome, because Russia is not going to let go of that land. Ukraine is not going to succeed in pushing Russia back. Russia is 4 times the size of Ukraine in population, and this is trench warfare, where you have an advantage on the defense. Whoever charges the trenches is going to get killed at a far greater rate than the defenders, far greater. So it's obviously absurd to have the smaller army charge the larger army when the larger army has massive defenses and will inflict casualties at a rate that is probably 3 to 1 or maybe worse. It's a hopeless situation. You might as well put your hand in a meat grinder. So, and every week that passes, there are more Ukrainian boys that die, more Russian, and I think we should have some sympathy too for the Russian boys that are dying in those trenches as well. Do they want to be there? Of course not. So just from a humanitarian standpoint, we should find, I think, we should push for a ceasefire and push for peace in that region. And I think then from a civilizational risk standpoint, we should restore normal relations with Russia. This seems like a logical path. And because the alternative is not an axis of evil, but an axis of immense power against the West, and laying the groundwork for World War III. And again, if one has to look at the sort of the scales of the decision, what good or bad things happen with one set of decisions versus another? And I see no benefit and only bad things, frankly, in prolonging the Ukraine-Russia conflict. I really see no positive side to this, and only bad things. It's both bad things for Ukraine and bad things for the United States and bad things for the world. So we should seek peace, I think, immediately. We should seek to restore normal relations as soon as possible. This is not some kind of reward for Russia. This is simply recognizing the realities and the risks that the world faces, and ensuring that there is the highest likelihood of a positive future for human civilization.
And I'm actually curious for either of you guys. One of the questions is, it's actually considered very gauche to ask this question, but I think it's actually a relevant question that we have not really touched on yet. How do we get Putin to have enough trust in doing that deal? I mean, I think I spend a lot of my airtime addressing the other objection, which I've done in other forums and don't need to do here, which is, should we trust Putin? And the answer is, we're trusting him to follow what should be in his self-interest right now to come out of that alliance with China and the corner we've put him in. But on the flip side, I don't know if one of you were to, wear your diplomatic hat. What would you?
I don't think this is not a matter of trust one way or the other. But for the same reason that Ukraine cannot advance meaningfully into primarily Russian-speaking regions in the eastern Ukraine, Russia cannot advance into the predominantly Ukrainian regions because they face a massive insurgency. They lack support from the local people. And whereas they have support from the local people in eastern Ukraine, they do not have support from local people in western Ukraine, in the western two-thirds. Russia is a country that has done incredibly well on the defense, but at least in the last 100 years, not so well on the offense, unless it is attacked. When you look at something like the Winter War against Finland, where Russia tried to because Finland at one point was part of the Russian Empire before World War I, they tried to invade Finland. And you think, and this was the Soviet Union, actually sort of the Warsaw, the Soviet Union trying to invade Finland, they failed. They could not take Finland. The Finns won. And we're talking Stalin here. Stalin that's not someone who takes no for an answer easily. Say, you don't want to be the general that reports back, hey, we're not succeeding in invading Finland. So, but they did. They did not succeed in against Finland. So this notion that, well, if there's some sort of thing, some sort of ceasefire, we don't even need an agreement, just a ceasefire. Guys, just stop killing each other for a minute. There's no actual treaty needed. Just stop killing each other for a minute, and then let's just figure out some path to a more positive future. There's a lot of people think, well, if that's happened, then Russia's going to immediately take in short order take the rest of Ukraine and then start invading the Baltics and taking a bunch of. And they will not succeed in that, because of the immense opposition of the local people. If they could take more of Ukraine, they would, and they can't. So, so I think we should stop sacrificing the flower of Ukrainian youth in trenches pointlessly, and do a ceasefire and begin the process of renormalizing relations with Russia. And it should be said that, Russia and Ukraine, I mean, they're quite literally cousins. Like the people have family in both. It's that the people in Ukraine have family in Russia. People in Russia have family in Ukraine. So they were sort of really part of one country for many, many years. The best rocket technology was when Ukraine and Russia were working together, and when they were not working together, their space technology suffered immensely. So, like what I'm trying to say is that these are not natural adversaries. It doesn't make sense. That they have their grievances, but they are quite literally family. And I think we in the West are sort of pushing them to kill their sons, and it seems wrong to me to do that. So, and then to add to the regional tragedy, there is the civilizational risk that we are brewing by making Russia a pariah to the West, not allowing international transactions with Russia, basically extreme sanctions. And I should say this weaponization of the dollar, I think we've overplayed our hand in weaponizing the dollar with sanctions. So because you're now seeing a lot of countries de-dollar their transactions. Because we've sort of forced it, and this goes beyond even Russia, China, and Iran, because countries like, say, Brazil or India still want to transact with Russia. They can't do it with dollars, so we force them to de-dollarize their transactions, thus weakening the strength of the dollar in the world. So, like these actions are strategically foolish, it seems to me. But like I said, we should just sort of stand back and say, what is the most important thing? The most important thing is avoiding World War III, because we may never recover from World War III. And I think we're currently have the risk of World War III is increasing rapidly. And I think if relations are renormalized with Russia, the probability of World War III is dramatically lower. So,
yeah, I actually think that it's far more achievable than we've made it out to be. And David, Zach, I got a lot more to say, but maybe you want to take a couple questions from the audience too. I saw someone from the IDF is asking a question too.
Okay, great. Yeah, maybe. I don't see. Let's see. Let me try and make you a co-host, and then you can call on people as well. While we're doing that, Alexander, why don't we get your take on whether it's still possible to work out a deal with Russia on Ukraine?
I think it is possible to come to a deal with Russia on Ukraine. It will not be easy at all, and the window for that deal is perhaps not going to be open indefinitely, because obviously there is a war, and that war is fluid. It has its own dynamic, and I personally think that the longer we leave it for a deal to be done with Russia on Ukraine, the more unsatisfactory to us that is going to be. Now, if I could just make a few observations generally about US-Russian relations. Firstly, I think we have to understand that there is going to be a continuum between the situation we have today, which is essentially that we have no contacts with the Russians. We don't trade with them. We don't speak to them. When we do speak to them, we just lecture them. And the situation of having a complete rapprochement in which we are back to a full normal relationship, such as we used to have after the end of the Cold War. Now, you can perhaps aim at the second, but you can start with perhaps less ambitious objectives. You can start talking, you can start meeting Russian officials and communicating with them and putting aside some of this extremely dangerous rhetoric that we have. Because just to give an example of what diplomacy is about, it's not just about working together to find long-term outcomes. Eventually we might come to that. But if we're talking about the present situation in the Middle East, one of the things that is making it so dangerous, one of the things that's making the Ukraine crisis so dangerous, is that because we are not talking to them and they are not talking to us, and we're not talking many cases to many of the various important players, everybody is guessing about what the other side's intentions might be. They're all having to speculate about what intentions are. So, for example, Putin probably thinks that there is no risk to his troops in Syria from the United States. But he doesn't know that. He hasn't had the categorical assurances from the US president that might make him confident in this. So he is going to have that element of doubt and uncertainty in his mind. And he's going to take precautions. And he said, well, I've got now my fighter jets flying over the Black Sea, and they've got hypersonic missiles, and this isn't a threat, it's just a warning. I'm warning you that if these missiles have the range to reach the Eastern Mediterranean, which is where your carriers happen to be. Now, that is actually a very bad situation for us all to be in, where Putin has to guess, and at the same time, because he can't be sure, he's having to take in his own mind those sort of precautions. That is exactly the kind of uncertainty which, in a crisis of the kind that we are going through at the moment, can potentially lead to disaster. Because, of course, where everybody is guessing, there is always the potential, there's always the very real risk that people will guess wrong, misunderstand what is happening, interpret things in the wrong way, and see things that might not actually be threatening in a particularly threatening way. So the first priority should be to start proper communications. Once you get communications going, then gradually over time you can rebuild trust, and perhaps you can have a proper, workable, viable relationship. Given how bad relations between the Russians and the West have now become, that is probably going to take a very long time. But what do they say? A journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. Talking to the Russians in a civil way about mutual problems, and by the way, Elon is right, there is no greater priority than preserving peace. You're not sacrificing your core interests by preserving peace. Preserving peace between the great powers, the superpowers, is a core interest. And all of the great powers, all the superpowers, they're all led by people who should understand this, will understand, if it's approached in a certain way, that achieving a sustainable peace is one in which all of the great powers respect the core interests of the other. So you can find your way, you can gradually build up a relationship in that way. But at the moment, given the very dangerous situation we are in, we must unblock these utterly, completely blocked communications channels. We must talk to the Russians. They must be able to talk to us, just as JFK did at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was in direct contact through the embassy with Khrushchev. They were sending letters to each other. They were communicating in that kind of way. We got to be able to do that. We got to be able to talk to the Chinese leaders, even if we see them as adversaries. We've got to be able to talk to the Iranians, and they've got to be able to talk with us. And doing it through, at lower levels, through meetings between spies and lower level diplomats, is never enough in a situation like this, where leaders have to be able to communicate directly to each other in order to get an understanding of each other and to understand, to develop trust.
Well, I would say Biden just did the opposite of that by putting Putin in the Hamas category in his latest speech. I mean, that's not the way to reestablish a communication channel.
Well, I think it was an absolutely brought together Putin with Hamas. I mean, they are completely different things. Let's be absolutely clear. Russia and Hamas have nothing in common with each other. I thought that was completely misconceived, and it has made further discussion at this time, not just between the Russians and the Americans, but the whole attitude behind the speech, even more difficult than it should be. As Vivek absolutely correctly said, way back during the Cold War, we had communications with each other. During the Vietnam War, Kissinger went to China. He brokered a meeting between Nixon and Mao Zedong. We had communications regularly with the Soviets, and the result was that peace between the great powers was preserved. We are not in that position at this time.
Yeah, and I just want to build on something Elon said, which is I think American policy must start with a realistic assessment of our power and the distribution of power. And I think this administration seems to be living in a past era when the US dominated the world and could do whatever it wanted. I think we saw this with the Ukraine war. Biden and the administration said that sanctions would collapse the Russian economy. It has not done that. I think the Russian economy had a negative 2% blip last year. Now it's back to growth. They claimed that the Russians were running out of missiles and other kinds of weapons. That has not happened. In fact, it's the US that has run out of 155 millimeter artillery ammunition, which is the key type of ammunition in this war. That to me was absolutely stunning, that the US could run out of artillery shells. I mean, we spend over 800 billion a year on defense, and apparently ammunition is not included. The administration claimed that this counteroffensive was going to be stunningly successful, and it's basically gone nowhere. In fact, the latest map published by the New York Times showed that, if anything, it's the Russians who've gained a small amount of territory on a net basis during this counteroffensive. So the administration has constantly now, for the last couple of years, put forward these assertions of what it was going to do and what its policies were going to lead to. And in every case, it's been hubristic. None of those predictions have come true. And now we find ourselves in perhaps the biggest crisis of all, and our stockpiles are depleted. And the administration does not seem to be using diplomacy in the way that Alexander just said. And so I think this is fundamentally the reason why even publications like Axios, which are well-connected Beltway publications, are sounding alarm bells about where things stand. So it's, again, they're quoting unnamed Washington officials. So this to me is the most dangerous part of it. Is in theory it should be easy to avoid World War III because no one wants it. But we have an administration in Washington that seems to be blundering around, that is constantly overplaying its hand,
Yeah,
and doesn't seem to be using diplomacy whatsoever.
I think we are sleepwalking our way into World War III. Sleepwalking our way into World War III. with one foolish decision after another, as you outlined, David. And and really, people should be deeply self-reflective. If their predictions have not come true, they should consider whether perhaps their other predictions might not come true either. I mean, what is the track record here? It's not good.
You know, it's funny in the investing world, you know, in the VC world in which, you know, we operate. Track record is all important. You know, when you want to assess whether an investor is good at their job or not, the first thing you look at is track record. But in
Exactly.
international relations, there seems
I
to
mean,
be no concept of a track record.
yes, it's astonishing, and the stakes are so much higher. I mean, we're talking about many lives and devastation, and you know, I just want to keep reiterating this point. Civilizational risk must be paramount, because if civilization goes away, it's all over for everyone. Just we should we've you know, it worries me that the veterans of World War II are almost all dead. So those who remember the horrors of a world war are no longer, who has the visceral knowledge of what a world war is really like. When people have grown up coddled in comfort, they have no concept of war. I remember talking to my grandfather, who was in World War II for, I think, almost 6 years, in brutal conflict in North and East Africa. All his friends were killed in front of him. He had severe PTSD, like severe. I didn't even know what it was as a kid, but so severe. And in fact, if he he didn't finish high school, so he wasn't eligible for the officer corps, and I think it was a year or two before the end of the war, they randomly gave some aptitude test or IQ test or whatever to people, and he scored high. So they sent him to work for British intelligence in London, which is where he met my grandmother, who's English. And if that hadn't happened, he'd be dead, and I probably wouldn't exist. But I mean, you could see the effects of war in his face and personality. I mean, it was just he was destroyed, even though he was still alive. And how many people like that actually are still around, who remember the horrors of a global war, or remember war at all?
Well, this is where I think we need some fresh leadership in Washington, because people who've been there for 30 years plus simply, I think, don't seem to remember or don't really understand the way in which the world has changed. We're not in the unipolar moment anymore.
Correct.
You know, and the people who developed all of their political instincts during that moment, I think, have failed to grasp the ways in which the world has changed. And this is why we need some fresh thinking and fresh leadership in Washington. I'm sure Vivek will agree with that.
Yeah, I'm biased, but I agree with you. And you know, one of the things is interesting in the polling data is amongst young people. I mean, and the idea of entering war, including the Ukraine war, but beyond this, is incredibly unpopular, right? I mean, those of us even who grew up in the Iraq and Afghanistan era alone, these things are very unpopular amongst young people. And the other thing that I'm seeing is, this is just a little bit of inside baseball here, but the general political conventional wisdom right now is most of the Republican base still is in favor of the good versus evil framing. But I will tell you, on the ground, that is not what I see when it's presented in a different form than the poll questions are served up. I mean, I've spent the last 5 days in Iowa, and you know, mostly everything I'm saying I've been advised is politically unadvisable to say to a Republican base. But to tell you the truth, once you explain to people, look, this is not that we're anti-Ukraine or anti-Israel, but this is a pro-American, or as Elon even put it, pro-civilizational view to keep us out of World War III. I see more heads nodding than not. And so I do think it's going to take people, not just in the presidency. I mean, I think the presidency is important. I think it's important that you have somebody that comes from a different generation, unbiased and unencumbered by the biases of the past in a liberal hegemonic era that does not exist anymore. It's not 1991. It's not 1980. We have to accept realism in where we are as the United States, or else we may make boneheaded decisions, sleepwalking our way into war that may cause the United States of America as we know it to be at risk of ceasing to exist. But I also think that it's going to require people in positions in the administration that, you can't come in as a post-neocon Republican and then put a bunch of neocons in the staffing of your administration from national security advisor to secretary of state on down. And I think it's going to take rational, reasoned thinkers who are able to understand how the interests of different nations align or don't align with one another and reach reasonable deals, consensus to bring peace in a situation that I think there's opportunities for it, both in the Russia-Ukraine situation and though under more complex circumstances, even in the conflict in the Middle East with Israel, that I think would best serve the interests of everyone involved, but certainly the United States. And I do think that we may be at our best in a moment where the U.S. is expressly thinking about its own interests and acknowledges that other nations are allowed to do the same, and then reasonably achieve paths to peace rather than trying to implement the model of liberal hegemony that I think many in both parties wish we were in from 30 years ago. So
Yeah,
that's what I think.
If I may play somewhat of a sort of slight devil's advocate for liberalism, actually, which may be unexpected, and also start off with a quote of, or paraphrase Samwise Gamgee from Lord of the Rings: "There is some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for." I think that is the good part of liberalism. That is that you actually have empathy for other people and other countries, and that there are times when we'll do things that perhaps don't entirely serve ourselves, but sometimes even sacrifice a little bit of the good of our country for the better of another. But we just need to make sure that is actually what is going to happen, and that in seeking to do good, we do not pave the road to hell. So that we are realistic in seeking to do good. I think we should seek to do good. I think that is one of the great characteristics of America, is that we actually do not simply act on the basis of might is right. And if you look at the history of the United States, well, after World War II, we had nukes and nobody else did. We could have taken over the world. We could have absolutely subjugated anyone. And yet, did we do that? No. In fact, we helped rebuild Japan. We helped rebuild Europe. And I think that served the greater good. But it's important to us that that is really quite unusual by historical standards. And I'm not saying that the United States only does good things. The United States has done good and bad things. But on balance, I think the United States has been a great force for benevolence, probably more so than any country in history. And that is worthy of admiration. And so I do think that is a good thing. But we don't want to be naive in seeking to do good. We want to care about the reality of doing good, not the perception of it. So
I think that's what.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying. I think that was beautifully said. I think we live in a moment right now where those things go together, where we bring a realism to our foreign policy. I think a realism would actually result in the outcome that was best for Ukraine, for Israel, but by looking at it through an actual realist perspective that, I think we live, at least right now, in a moment where that's actually going to lead to the greater good by advancing, a national self-interest in this moment we're in. I think that's actually the frame that will achieve the greater good result that you talk about too. So I think we're synchronous, but maybe coming at it from different angles there.
So, sounds good. Yeah, I just think like sometimes, Vivek, I think I agree with you actually, but I just want to make sure that people sort of generally understand that we're not talking about sort of just engaging in purely selfish behavior, that only ever serves purely the interests of the United States, but that we actually do care about other countries and other people, and we want to make sure that that actions we take are actually successful in helping those people, and do not actually, as we seek perhaps to help them, in fact hurt them. So there's I'm a big fan of South Park and the Trey Parker and Matt Stone, and there's a movie Team America where Team America World Police. The movie starts off with with a sort of terrorist attack in Paris, and then Team America comes in to just destroy the terrorists, but also levels half of Paris. It's like, well, I don't know if that was, should we have leveled half of Paris to destroy some terrorists? Perhaps not. So we just need to make sure that when we seek to do good, that we in fact do achieve it, and that we're realistic and do not inadvertently pave the road to hell with our good intentions.
Amen. I'm good for another at least 10 minutes, X, but I think that's actually
that could be a great moment to end on.
Yeah, I think well said, Elon, and I think that I am an advocate for, and let me just say this, talk about the presidency, that's in self-interest or whatever to talk about new people and outsiders and whatever, but go a layer deeper. The more I've learned about this, I think the more I'm convinced that you not only need that at the level of whoever's on top of the executive branch, but in the State Department, in other parts of the federal bureaucracy that hopefully only a small subset of which survive, still need probably in the next chapter some people who have a muscle memory different than the one they've been trained on, which is to think they're doing good or convince themselves of the ultimate lie that they're doing good when in fact they're creating more harm than good, even not just for the United States, but for those other very actors they purport to help. And so, we'll see if we can't get there and, clean that up and staff it accordingly. So thank you guys. Appreciate this discussion. Learned a lot actually today too from the others who participated. So thanks to everybody else you called on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Policy Tensor. Thanks, Colonel Davis. Thanks to everyone who participated. We'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, guys.